As I'm still working on my long-ass review of the DLC, I wanted to take some time to dive deeper into my actual thoughts on the game and the comparisons that are drawn to me. Firstly, the length. I think Elden Ring's length is both perfect and rushed at the same time. The hours to complete the game with an above-average side content completion takes about 60 to 70 hours depending on A, skill, and B, if you summon. I can't think of very many single-player games that can really hold a person's interest for longer than 60 hours. Skyrim is perhaps the closest, especially if you're on PC, but that game is so outdated that it almost feels unfair to compare the two. To clarify, I mean nothing of the graphics or performance, as graphics don't impact a game's quality, just add to it, and I experienced minor performance issues with either. The problem with Skyrim is Bethesda. They do not evolve like normal games. In fact, they evolve extremely slowly, if not at all, if you take Starfield into account. I bring this up because FromSoft has very much evolved and worked to perfect their mechanics and experience in a way that I can only pray Elder Scrolls 6 attempts to match. I've never played any Souls game outside of Elden Ring and a measly 2-ish hours on Sekiro, but I have watched multiple people clear all the other games, and the progress from game to game is very clear. As I said in my closing statements of my previous video, Skyrim has better quests. In fact, it actually has quests. There are numerous optional factions and characters that can send you on 10-hour-long journeys your first time through. Whole armor sets, areas, and lore are hidden away behind quests that are handed to you like you're a fat kid on Halloween. The downside to Skyrim's quest system is that A, there's no time gating, which, to put it simply, you can leave and come back at any point in the game or in any other quests. Those entire quests are essentially paused until you, the player, return. And B, you, the player, are always the chosen one. Every single quest makes your character feel like the most important person to whatever faction you're joining. I mean, if you do all of Skyrim quests, you're the wielder of basically every single god-given artifact, the chosen one and leader of the Dark Brotherhood, the Thieves Guild, the Nightingales, the Companions, either the Stormcloaks or the Imperials, and the Winterhold College. Now, some of these you don't become the leader, but you become infamous and essentially the right-hand man at the very least. The point is, you the player are too invaluable to every single faction, and not a single one of them react to your status in another. This is where Elden Ring does have an advantage. Partially, that is. Quests are time-gated, which I do believe is how quests should be in 99% of RPGs. Secondly, in more than half of the quests in Elden Ring, you're just a dude who did a thing. Outside of the main quest lines, you're just a nobody who showed up and did whatever it was that they asked you to do. This, despite seeming like it shouldn't, makes you feel more accomplished as the game progresses than the other approach, because it lets you, the player, create your own story. Did you kill this person instead of helping them? Ignore them? Did you defeat Melania? What about her brother's keeper? The choices you make, while are few and generally more of a did I want to spend 5 hours getting spanked by a one-armed burn victim with AIDS, or did I not, do add to your tarnished story. In Skyrim, it feels like you have to do those quests or else you're just not playing the main story. Partially because the main story, while grandiose, is fairly lame compared to the other main quest lines. This brings me to the complaint I leveled at Elden Ring once before, the lack of clarity in said quest lines. It is almost never clear what the next step is or where it is, excluding some of the main quest lines, that is. And while I do respect that this is on the player to pay attention, it is also on the game to give me all the information I need in order to complete said objective. And that is where I'm afraid Elden Ring falters. This brings me to the other comparison I made prior, and the one I want to elaborate on the most, Baldur's Gate 3. It is important to note that this game is firstly based on D&D and secondly not an action RPG, but rather a turn-based RPG. This is an important distinction, but I think one can certainly learn from the other despite that distinction. Baldur's Gate 3 hands out quests as much as you want them. Being a dialogue-heavy game, you can accept, decline, ignore, or kill any quests and their givers at your freedom. Most quests here are time-gated to an extent, but mainly just linked to the main story beats. The difference here is that you have a journal that lets you recall the entire conversation you had with the NPC at any point in the game, as well as a quest log that tells you where to go and what to do. This gives you the option of figuring it out yourself, or going to the yellow marker and doing whatever thing it tells you to do. This is what I believe is a perfect balance. It allows people to play how they want to play, do what they want to do. Now, to Elden Ring's defense, the lack of quantity of quests is so drastic that implementing 2 different menus for it may be overkill, especially with how short and easy some of those quests are. That being said, how would I ever have completed Randy's quest without an online guide or just stumbling upon it out of pure luck? Elden Ring's length depends a lot on how good you are and how many quests you manage to come across in the right order. I do think that there is a bit of a boss rush at the end of the game, but to be completely honest, I think it's not only good for the game, but the story as well. By the time you get to Malekith, you should be 120 fairly easily, with probably 60 levels in whatever damage modifier you're using, and most likely 30 levels or more in Vigor. Add to that the ease at which you can get to 14 flasks and all the ball bearings to easily level weapons makes you basically impervious to most regular enemies. Sure, the Beastmen and everyone at the Hallowed Tree are overtuned, but you can still run through them with ease at this point in the game. That makes bosses the only real challenge left for the player. Malekith, Melania, and Mohg are all extremely difficult fights, with Hoarah, Radagon, and Elden Beast being no easy feat on their own. This is the only challenge the game can naturally provide at this point. It is fair to say that all of these bosses have unique fighting styles and interesting gimmicks. To be as blunt as possible, the Brothers of Marge are still difficult at this point in the game, but you can both out-heal and out-damage them if you don't already have their moveset memorized. And as for the story, what else is there to give a claim to our Tarnished? You start this so-called boss rush by killing the bound servant of Elden Ring's god, who wields the only thing that can kill anyone. From that point on, no death from any normal enemy will impact how the player feels about their story. The bosses are the only way for the story to finish, for the crescendo to continue to rise. It would not be fair of me to skip out on talking about the best part of Elden Ring, the weapons, and to a greater extent, the gameplay. There are well over 300 weapons, not counting spells, and the total list is probably closer to 500 if you counted spells. While not every weapon is good, every weapon is viable. Weapons and spells alike seem to form themselves in a bit of a progressive pattern. For example, the simple dagger you would get early on is perfectly viable, but the butcher knife is just better in every way. The downside is it comes later and drops less. The Reduvia can be earned fairly easy if you know how to get it, but it's a quest item so you can only get one per playthrough. So despite being the best in the dagger category, you'd likely have to play another game to get another and thus power stance them. Most weapon categories work this way, with better weapons being acquired later in the game or once per game. This is fairly typical for any well-designed game, to be honest, but Elden Ring sticks out because of the Ash of War system. Unique weapons come with an unchangeable ability that can't be given in Affinity, while non-unique weapons let you choose any non-unique ability, to which there are many, and an affinity to apply to them. You can make your weapon deal bleeding damage, frost damage, holy damage, or you can make it scale better with strength, dexterity, or intellect for magic users to allow for more versatility. And this simple separation allows some non-unique weapons like the Colossal Sword to be just as good, if not better, than some unique weapons such as the Bloodhound's Fang. This basic system allows you to have such a vast variety in playstyles without having to stray outside of your given class, as it were. I found this system to be so massively more intuitive and fun than Skyrim's, which is separated solely by A, weapon type, and B, material. Skyrim offered enchantments, sure, but you constantly had to recharge them if you wanted to use them, whereas in Elden Ring you can find at least one weapon in just about every weapon category that you can use with your main damage stat. And if you get a weapon you want to use, but can't, all you have to do is respec to meet the requirements. Whereas in Skyrim, you'd have to level up that weapon's skill tree to reap the benefits of using it. While Elden Ring is not exactly generous with the material necessary to respec, it is nonetheless much easier to switch builds and playstyles than it is in Skyrim. This moves me on to perhaps the main reason anyone plays Elden Ring: the gameplay. Elden Ring's combat is like playing checkers on a chessboard. The mechanics are simple, but nuanced. Roll or block to avoid attacks. Heavy attacks do more damage, but take longer to charge up. And the damage you do is permanent, with a few exceptions. These 3 basic rules, while extremely simple, have an extreme amount of depth. So yes, you can absolutely club your way through the game with a brass shield and reposts, using status effects to deal more damage over time. But if you look deeper, you'd find that rolling uses less stamina. It can position you out of the way of the rest of the enemy's attack chain and allow you more attack opportunities. Furthermore, you would find that heavy and jumping attacks, while higher risk, deal more damage to posture, which, once broken, allows for a free critical hit. The advantage that comes with this nuance isn't given, it's earned, and that's for the simple fact that most people are either horrible at timing dodges or terrified of dying and will use the shield as I did, or roll away from the boss rather than towards him. Most people don't want to risk taking damage by doing a charged heavy attack or jumping at a boss, but these things allow for the player to hone their craft. It allows them to live up to the legend of the character, should they want to. And that's the beauty of Elden Ring. Unlike Skyrim, where you're the chosen one to every person you meet, or Baldur's Gate, where you're just conveniently that one that can save or condemn the world to its fate, in Elden Ring, you're a nobody. A worthless, faceless, unsupported nobody who against all odds becomes the Elden Lord. Perhaps you did it lore accurately and didn't get touched by destined death a single time. Perhaps you did it at level 1 or without taking a single hit at all. Perhaps you sat behind the biggest shield you could find with the heaviest armor you could find. The story is just as much yours here as it is in other games, but here the story is written by you and not them. That's not to say having a story written for you is a bad thing, just different. The clearest way I can put it is this. In Elden Ring, the events happen regardless of your involvement. If you didn't do it, someone else would someday down the line. The player is just the next bike. Whereas in Skyrim, events only take place because of the player, to service the player. Baldur's Gate 3, as usual, finds a balance between the two. The events would transpire regardless of your involvement, but the outcome would only be the total domination of the entire world. In short, absolute defeat. This is because a player holds the characters who can change the course of history together. The player is a mediator that's required to succeed with such a diverse set of characters and beliefs. Let me direct this ever so briefly to another comparison. Metro Exodus, a game I played probably 2 hours of at most. This was because in this game the protagonist is silent, but everyone acts as though you're responding to them, essentially like an interactive book where the response is just whatever the player thinks of. The problem is that this doesn't work for adults like it does for children. Adults are much more nuanced and with much less concern with being right. So when whatever NPC assumed I answered his question the way he wanted me to for the 5th time, I just felt like I was being taken out of the story. Or rather, that the story wasn't for me. It felt like I was being talked at, not to. Elden Ring also has a mostly silent protagonist, short of a few typically insignificant dialogue options, but whenever people are talking to you, they never assume your answer. They just speak to you as if you're one of a million different people to ask them the same question. And that's the beauty of it. You aren't special. In Elden Ring, there isn't any actual death until Malekith is defeated, and so for this reason, most of the inhabitants have lived a long life, and have watched multiple Tarnished with much more acclaim than the player ask the same question, and all fail all the same. Your character isn't special. Your character isn't the chosen one. Your character is inevitable. If it wasn't you, it would be someone else down the line, whether that be in 10 years or 100 years. Story doesn't need the player to happen. The player just becomes that which was foretold. Essentially, you're the chosen one, but not until you finish the game. Up until the Elden Beast is slain, you are just another Tarnished who is flying ever so close to the sun. You've gotten further than others, sure, but the likelihood you fail? High. And that makes your strength all the more incredible. This simple change makes the game stand out so significantly. Most games don't waste any time in telling the player how important they are, which, while not inherently bad, can get a tad stale. Skyrim, Hogwarts Legacy, Breath of the Wild, Dragon's Dogma 2, or Fable, to name a few. The point I'm trying to make is that being the chosen one is common. The alternative is not, and I don't see very many people give Elden Ring the praise it deserves in regard to this area. With Shadow of the Erdtree receiving many calls for Game of the Year, despite the fact that it is a DLC, and Black Myth Wukong releasing in a week, I'd like to reflect on Elden Ring as a whole and the impact it is likely to have on games moving forward. I believe that there have been very few games that defined a genre, and thus every game that followed it. Halo 2, Knights of the Old Republic, Skyrim, Baldur's Gate 3, and Elden Ring. This is excluding games and genres that I'm not as familiar with, such as MMOs. When Elden Ring first released, I heard about it constantly. Everyone was playing it, and I distinctly remember ignoring the hype, thinking to myself that I don't like Souls games. When Elden Ring won Game of the Year over Horizon Forbidden West and more notably God of War Ragnarok, I was kind of annoyed. I remember thinking that the hype made people vote a Death Simulator Game of the Year over a decently fun open world game and an extremely well written story game. But with my second playthrough of the main game nearly complete, I can reflect on how wrong I was. The impact this game will be massive. In fact, I remember developers tweeting that not every game should be held to the standard of Elden Ring, a sentiment that would come around again for 2023's Game of the Year. Now, I could reiterate what many people already know about how Elden Ring sold a shit ton, or how it dominated Steam's charts for longer than most single-player games should, but that would be redundant. Instead, I want to focus on one aspect of the game that will define the next generation of games to come. For example, Knights of the Old Republic set the stage for long, dialogue-based story games. Halo 2 revolutionized online gaming. Skyrim gave people the freedom and scale that other games lacked. Baldur's Gate 3, to its credit, did all of what those previous games did, but better. And Elden Ring, what will it be known for? I personally would say that out of everything it did, the challenge is what it will be known for. The bosses are hard but choreographed, and I think that's what will live on in future games. Memorable bosses and a refusal to hold your hand. The collective suffering at the hands of Malenia, or the complaints about Elden Beast running away from you the entire fight. These fights and their characters are, while flawed, what define Elden Ring. Because not only do you have a boss who has a move that is essentially undodgeable, but she also has such memorable dialogue despite the perhaps 4 or so lines that she has. I believe that FromSoft should be commended for the voice lines in this game, because they had to be good enough that people can hear them hundreds of times and still not be bored of them. In short, Elden Ring is, without question, one of the greatest games of all time, and the impact it will have on the game industry will be nothing short of extraordinary.